Today's date is April 18th, 2002. My name is Paul Robards, Library Director of Roberts Memorial Library at Middle Georgia College. I was speaking today with Colonel Michael Chaloult from Warner Robins, Georgia, about his experiences in the Vietnam War. What branch of the military did you serve in?
I was in the United States Air Force.
Why did you join the military?
I had always had a fond for aircraft. From my early childhood, I wanted to be a flyer, and that led me to either the Navy or the Air Force, and I applied to both, and the Air Force called first.
How old were you when you joined the military?
I joined just after my 20th birthday.
What was your hometown when you joined?
My hometown at that time was Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Where did you go to basic training?
Well, I didn't really go to basic training. I enlisted in the Air Force, and I was accepted into the Aviation Cadet Program. So I did my training at Harlingen Air Force Base in Harlingen, Texas, where at the same time I got my commission and my wings.
Okay.
So it was navigator training along with commissioning program.
What aspects of your training did you use in Vietnam?
I used just about every bit of it, although there were some things that weren't covered, and maybe we'll get into that later on in this conversation. But I think the training that I had probably prepared me quite well for the tasks that I was going to perform, but not all of them.
Do you think that the military training changed you in any way?
No, I can't put my finger on anything.
What was your job description or occupation code?
My job description was a navigator bombardier and a B-57 aircraft, which is an attack light bomber. And the AFSC at that time was 1525.
Did you volunteer to go to Vietnam?
No, I didn't.
How did you feel when you learned you were going to Vietnam?
I was quite excited. It was an interesting notification, and if we have time, I can get into that a little bit. I was visiting my parents in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, over the Christmas holidays in 1964. And we had just, my wife and I had just we had a 6-month-old son, and we were enjoying the holidays with my parents here in Florida. When we left shortly after New Year's, and I was going to stop on our first night to visit an old high school buddy of mine who was stationed in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. And when we arrived at his house, his wife informed me that she'd had a call from my ops officer that I was to call immediately, and so I did. And he informed me that they had permanent change of station orders for me. He couldn't reveal any other information at that time, but he told me that I would be going bearing an airplane, which meant that we were going to take something somewhere, and that I was to hurry back to, I was stationed at Biggs Air Force Base in El Paso, Texas at that time. He said I would hurry back as soon as possible because we would be leaving soon. So we did.
In what regions, towns, or villages did you serve in Vietnam?
I was in at Benoit Air Force Base. I flew out of Chaloult Air Force Base, or Air Base, excuse me, and out of Da Nang Air Base.
What are the names of the units you were assigned to?
The whole time it was the 8th Bomb Squadron.
Describe your living conditions, housing, and food in Vietnam.
Well, it varied at the 3 locations. At Benoit, we lived in, I think there were 12-man hooches with central latrines and so forth. The food was provided at the Officers Club, It was the officers' dining hall. At Chaloult, we lived in an Army BOQ, which was located in downtown Saigon. And
that's good quarters.
Well, the quarters weren't bad. It was getting to and from the quarters out to Chaloult Air Base that was the interesting part, because if you ever were in Saigon in 1965, you had every means of transportable vehicle traveling on the roads, from ox carts and pedicabs to tanks and half-tracks and all kinds of different vehicles. So that the trip to the base was almost as hazardous as the flight.
What did you do for entertainment?
Oh, for entertainment, we played cards, we played volleyball, those sorts of things.
Could you please tell me what happened during your first encounter with the enemy and how you reacted to it?
Well, I flew an airplane over from Clark Air Base in the Philippines into Ben Hoa. Arrived there about 11 o'clock in the morning and was informed that we were on the flight schedule for a mission that afternoon. That was my first encounter, and the way we operated at that time is we had a pilot and a navigator in the airplane. For the first 2 or 3 missions, we split the crew up, and a new navigator would fly with an old pilot, an older navigator would fly with a new pilot. Or when I say new, it's one who has not flown in the environment there before. So we flew our first mission, and I flew with a guy by the name of Bud Chambers that day. My regular pilot was Bill Mattis. Bill Mattis flew with Bud's navigator. Bill didn't make it back in that mission. He was shot down. That was my welcome to Vietnam.
Wow.
So after the first mission that afternoon, the next one was to North Vietnam. Following day. And it went on from there.
What was the most humorous event you witnessed or that happened to you?
Probably the most humorous thing was we carried various armaments on the aircraft depending on the target. One of our missions was armed road recce through Laos and North Vietnam. Well, we would look for truck traffic and so forth. Okay, that particular mission, we carried rockets, armor-piercing rockets. Well, we didn't see anything on the road that day. So when we came back over the fence into South Vietnam, we still had a full load of ammo and so forth. So we were, our GCA controller said to contact a FAC at such location that he had a target for us. So we did. And what this FAC had, FAC is forward air controller. The target that he had was rice storage, hooches, thatched roof, thatched sides, and so forth. Well, we had 2.75-inch folding fin armor-piercing rockets on board. The funniest thing was when we fired at these hooches, all we did was put a 2.75-inch hole going in one side and out the other side. And those rockets are probably still going, as far as I know, until they run into a mountain somewhere.
What engagements or campaigns did you serve in?
Well, I guess there were 3 campaigns during my time, because I was there early on in 1965 and 1966. I don't recall the names of those campaigns.
What kind of weapons did your unit employ?
Well, we could carry, on the aircraft, we carried bombs internally. We also had 8 external stations on the wings. 4 of those were stressed for bombs and 4 for rockets. So the inboard external stations were carried bombs, and on the outboard external stations we carried rockets. We didn't use rockets very much because of the incident that I just told you. The targets just weren't there for that kind of equipment. We carried napalm, We carried thermite bombs. The aircraft could carry 9 500-pounders internally or 21 260-pound frag bombs internally. We usually carried 750-pound general-purpose bombs externally. We had 1,000-pounders that we could carry. So, and also, each aircraft either had 4 20-millimeter guns mounted in the wings or 8 50 calibers. And the difference in the guns depended upon the block model of the aircraft and when it was produced. The early models had the 50 cals, the later models had the 20 millimeters.
As a navigator bombardier, how many combat missions did you fly?
211.
If your plane was ever hit by enemy fire, could you share some of those memories?
Yes, we were hit several times, different occasions. Nothing really remarkable because we never had any serious effects from it. Unlike some of the guys that were shot down or encountered the radar-controlled AAA anti-aircraft that the North Vietnamese had, 37 millimeter and 57 millimeter that we would encounter up there. In the South, it was primarily the Chinese equivalent of the Quad 50 that the Army used, which was what, 12.7 millimeter or something like that.
Yeah.
That was the most common ground fire that we encountered in the South, was from the Quad 50s or the Quad 27 millimeter. It was interesting. Our intelligence people showed us some of the ways that the South Vietnamese gunners, not South Vietnamese, but the Viet Cong gunners used to track an airplane. They would identify the airplane, and they had fixed, I guess you would call it some kind of an armament thing, that with the silhouette of the airplane at various distances from the center line of the guns to track. What the gunner would do was superimpose that silhouette over the aircraft on its bomb run or its strafing pass or whatever, and that would give him the lead that he needed for the airspeed that particular aircraft normally flew on a gun run or a napalm run or a dive bomb pass.
A cheap method of getting it done.
Well, those guys didn't have a lot of training. I mean, most of them were uneducated, but very dedicated, very disciplined.
Describe the most memorable event that happened when you were in Vietnam.
That had to be, we were called off alert one night to help defend a special forces camp in the Central Highlands that was being overrun by, actually it was one of the first encounters with regular North Vietnamese Army troops, interspersed with Viet Cong. But we got there, it was still dark, the weather was marginal, the low ceiling. There was a AC-47 flare ship that was already in the area. And one of the most severe impediments that we had in this whole conflict was communications. We couldn't talk directly with our communications gear to the guys on the ground. So it had to be relayed through the gunship, or the flare ship. They were in contact with the guys on the ground. We found a sucker hole where we could get down below the overcast, and the enemy, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, at that point, when we first saw them, were on the wire. Just like you were talking about earlier. And in this camp, this small Special Forces camp, was about to be overrun. And And the flare ship, which relayed what the ground troops were saying, it says, go ahead and string your bombs on the wire. So that's where the enemy is, and that's where we got to get them, stop them. So we tried to line up. We didn't have enough altitude to do a normal dive bomb run. So I was hastily computing sight depressions and release angles and that sort of thing. Well, the pilot was trying to get us lined up so that we could make a run parallel to the fence or the wire. So we did. We laid a string of 500-pounders in there. The word we got back from the flare ship was that the guys on the ground said that was great. Make another run the same way. You still have ordnance? I said, we got plenty. We stayed there for about an hour. And the flare ship, because he couldn't see the ground, would drift off with his flares, which we needed to see what we were doing underneath. So I was trying to get him back over the target that we had, and it was quite a hectic experience, but it was very rewarding. And the fact that we did keep those guys from being overrun. At daylight, we were relieved by some A1s that came out of Benoit, and they took over from that point. But we spent probably about an hour underneath the overcast. And we did strafing, we did bombing, whatever we had.
Describe the bravest action, either friend or enemy, that you witnessed while serving in Vietnam.
The bravest was crew Larry Mason and his navigator. Brought back an airplane that had been hit with AAA over North Vietnam. The navigator was severely wounded. The airplane was marginally controllable. He could have bailed out, but he brought that airplane back and was able to land it and save the guy in the back seat.
Please evaluate the North Vietnamese overall fighting ability. What were their strengths and weaknesses?
Get back to the earlier one that I mentioned before. He was awarded the Air Force Cross for that, which is the second highest decoration. Anyway, what was your question?
Please evaluate the North Vietnamese overall fighting ability. What were their strengths and weaknesses?
Overall fighting ability, they were tenacious. Their leadership, it's hard for me to say because, we didn't have that much contact with them. But from what I saw when we were in a close air support role and so forth, these guys were just, they were like bulldogs. They wouldn't let go. Once they got started on an objective, they kept at it.
What is your evaluation of South Vietnamese fighting units and their military and civilian leaders?
Well, I can give you, from my perspective, I flew with some of the South Vietnamese guys. In fact, there was a plan that we would turn over some of our aircraft to the South Vietnamese, and we did some training with them. I was an instructor navigator at the time, so I flew with these guys, the South Vietnamese pilots, and their navigators flew with our pilots. We had the initial cadre was 4. There were 2 pilots, 2 navigators, and I flew I think 3 or 4 missions with Major Bien of the South Vietnamese Air Force. Good stick and rudder guy. Marginal on instruments. They never trained with instruments. They never had any need for them. If the weather was bad, they didn't go. But yeah, they were good. They did a good job with putting ordnance on the target. good at strafing and napalm, and all the various tactics that you used.
What is your evaluation of American military leadership during the Vietnam War and of your immediate commanders in the field?
My immediate commanders were great. We had one guy for most of the time that I was there. I can remember when he came in. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Farr was his name. He, one of the first things he said, he gathered us all into the briefing room that we had there at Da Nang, and said, "Okay," he said, "I've never done this before in this environment." He'd been in Korea, but he hadn't been in South Vietnam. So he said, "I want to fly one of every type of mission that we are tasked to do, and I'll do it on somebody's wing. And after that," he said, "I'll lead everything." And he said, "Until I get to feel things," he said, "I'm going to be a wingman."
It's a rare quality.
And we went from there, and he was a great guy.
What medals or awards did you receive for serving in Vietnam?
I got 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 10 Air Medals, Air Force Commendation Medal, Outstanding Unit Award with 2 V devices, Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm, Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, Vietnam Campaign Medal. It's a bunch of it.
Yeah. Do you think you understood the reason for the war when you were serving in Vietnam, and has your understanding of the reasons changed?
Did I understand everything? No. I was a first lieutenant. I did what I was told to do. And I guess looking back at it, and I've done a lot of reading about it and so forth, I mean, it was a very complex political and military environment at that time. We had the domino theory, we had all these other high-level things that affected the things that we did. I guess I was probably most affected and disturbed by the fact that things were controlled back at Washington, D.C. by civilians rather than by the military commanders who were in the field and on the ground. There were incidents where, we got in trouble one time for striking a power plant in North Vietnam that we were receiving ground fire from, because that power plant wasn't on the authorized target list. That somebody back in the United States had decided it was a viable target or not.
How did you feel about your military service in Vietnam when you left the country?
When I left Vietnam?
Left Vietnam, yes, sir.
To come back home? Well, I was very proud of what I'd done. I was very disappointed at the reaction that I got when I got back to the United States. We weren't very well. In fact, I was told that when we got back to California, that we should change into civilian clothes before we went down to the San Francisco airport, because if we were there in uniform, we would be subject to harassment. That's a little bit different from the way things are today.
Yes, sir. How did this war experience most affect your life?
I guess, what, are you looking for a psychological
whatever comes to mind.
I can't say that had much effect other than the fact that, I got in, I did what I was supposed to do, what I was trained to do, came back and went on with my career.
Would you repeat this experience if you could do it over again?
Sure.
Is there anything we haven't brought up that you would like to share about your Vietnam War experience?
Well, other than the fact that, I started things off 9 days after I got back to El Paso when we were notified. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, picking up an airplane from the Kentucky Air Guard, along with 8 other crews. We were the only active duty Air Force crews at that time that were flying the airplane in the United States. And we took those airplanes across the pond to Clark. I was actually stationed, my PCS station was Clark Air Base in the Philippines. We did all of our flying out of Vietnam on a TDY basis, temporary duty. The trip across the pond was interesting because this was in January. The aircraft had marginal range capabilities to make it with the winds that you normally got at that time of year. So we went from Standiford Field in Louisville, Kentucky. We were supposed to go into McClellan Air Base in California. We were diverted en route to Navy Moffett, which was about 60 miles closer to our first stop in Hawaii. We had ferry tank in the bomb bay, fuel tank for extra fuel. The airplane had no mid-air refueling capability. When we were departing from Navy Moffett, all tanks were topped off. We were towed to the end of the runway. Plugged in a power card, got our clearances and all that kind of stuff. Power card. We were cleared for takeoff. Unplugged the power card, fired the engines, and rolled. Of the 9 airplanes, we went in 3 flights of 3. Of the 9 airplanes, when we got to Hawaii, we had 2 guys with emergency fuel. That meant that they had to make a landing on that particular approach, or they didn't have enough gas to go around. We had another couple of guys with minimum fuel, which meant that they could make a missed approach and come back in and land. And the rest of us were pretty close to minimum fuel. So that was an interesting trip across there. At Hickam, when we rolled out to take off from there, we aborted because we had a boost pump in our number 2 fuel tank that wouldn't pump. So my pilot and I, Chuck Ramsey and I, stayed at Hickam until there was an en route support team that went with us mechanics and ground support personnel until they came back and fixed us. And then we went by ourselves across the pond. Now, the airplane had no navigation equipment, no HF radio, so once you were out of line of sight communications, you couldn't talk to anybody. Wake Island is 2,000 miles that way. We were cruise climbing and up to in order to have enough gas to make it. It was one method, because as the airplane would get lighter, burning off fuel, you could climb higher and use less fuel. And we got a call on guard from another aircraft that we responded. they said, well, air traffic control has been looking for you guys because we hadn't heard from you. I said, well, we can't talk to air traffic control because we don't have a HF radio. But they said, just tell them that we're plugging along. We'll make it. And by the way, where are you guys? They had launched in a C-130 from Hickam just about 15 minutes ahead of us. So I said, we should be pretty close to you. And we're 47,000 feet. We're pulling contrails, so if you see us, give us a shout. And I said, after a few minutes, I said, yeah, we got contrails. I said, hey, we're going to do a turn to the right and then to the left, and so that you can identify it if that's us. And we did, and they did, and said, it looks like you're north of course. And I said, great. I said, we're going to alter heading and get back down. And he said, let us know when we're almost on track to go to Wake. So they did. And I said, okay, guys, see you on the ground. Beer's on me. But the whole trip and assignment was kind of an interesting experience because, and I digress a little bit, but the airplanes that we were flying in the United States were electronic warfare aircraft. I was an electronic warfare officer. I was a basic navigator by training, but I'd gone to advanced training to be an electronic warfare officer, as were all the other guys in the other 9 crews. Well, when we got to Kentucky to take the airplanes from the Guard, the guy who was handling the mission said, you guys are all basic navigators. You got to be a fully qualified navigator in order to ferry an airplane. I said, oh, okay. I guess we can all go home. I said, no. The next morning before we took off, we were all fully qualified. When we got to Clark, same thing happened again. You got to be a fully qualified, or you got to be a navigator bombardier. That's a different Air Force specialty code, which requires a year's worth of training. Make a long story short, we all became entry-level navigator bombardiers, and after 1 year in the entry level, we were all upgraded to fully qualified.
3 for 1.
Yeah. So that was some of the experiences just getting into it. But other than that, the whole tour, there was a number of incidents. We lost a lot of airplanes. We lost a lot of good people. I told you about my first pilot. In fact, the guy that I flew my first combat mission with, Bud Chambers, was later shot down. And one of my roommates at Clark also was shot down. And they never came back. One day we lost 12 airplanes when the ramp blew up at Benoit. And the story was it was a faulty delayed action fuse on some of the weapons that we were carrying. But it wiped out, I think, 10 airplanes that day, and we lost 12 crew members in one event. That's why we moved from Benoit down to Tonsanut and operated out of there for a short period of time, for about 6 weeks, while they were moving the 105 outfit out of Da Nang over to Thailand. And then we took their place up at Da Nang.
Colonel, thank you for your service to the country, and thank you for participating